Today we'll be talking about inflation, interest rates, even the scandalous idea of printing money. What is monetary policy even for? We are live and anything can happen. Let's do some real time. Welcome back to Real Time with Steve Keen and friends. Hope you've subscribed and hit that notification bell because we want you back next time when we go live. We're going to be unpacking a topic that's both misunderstood and incredibly important: monetary policy. I wonder why it's misunderstood. It's almost as if it's deliberate. We're not going to bore you with technical jargon. We're here to understand how the choices made in finance sector boardrooms and central banks affect your everyday life and the systems we depend on. Inflation, both in the US and Europe, is currently hovering just under 3%, and interest rates are just under 5%. Politicians and pundits like to connect these two as if they're causal, but what if the only connection is through correlation only, and monetary tightening or loosening is a completely political choice? For those familiar with this question, so far so obvious, but who benefits from the status quo and who doesn't? We'll explore how monetary policy has evolved historically from its roots in neoclassical economics to the heterodox perspectives that challenge those assumptions. And we'll ask if it truly delivers on the promise of price stability and full employment, or if it's just reinforcing inequality. How do interest rates impact small businesses, renters, and workers? And why does the mainstream narrative about inflation center on monetary policy and not fiscal policies, supply shocks, productive capacity, or gasp, pricing markups? Right, less gas bagging from me. Let's get the rest of the gang in here. Where are they? Hello, there they are, Steve Keen.
Oh, yeah, pardon. G'day. I was checking my data. Usual story, checking the other computer.
Is everyone there? Let me just change something on the screen. How's everybody doing? How's the week been going?
Oh, I'm getting used to being back in Amsterdam again, which after spending a week in London with Mike, actually, and a bunch of other energy modelers. So sort of worthwhile, but I'm glad to be home and glad to be working on my own research again.
I like how you call it home now. That's home. And what's Australia? A second home, third home?
The nest, which I left a long time ago.
Yeah, right. And Mike, how are you?
You're muted.
Yeah, we decided to mute you, Mike, because that's just more amusing. We'll make up something about Mike.
Okay, how about now?
That was a bit better. Yeah.
Well, Tim the Toolman Taylor back in the house.
The computer gods will allow me to speak.
Very
good.
Good.
I'm good. I've been traveling for the last 3 weeks, both domestically and abroad. So the email is piled to the ceiling and the mail and all that. So digging out, starting the new year, all good.
Very good. Well, I managed to watch a really interesting show, historical drama, which you guys might have seen if you've seen the previews on Netflix, called American Primeval. It's set in 1857 in Utah, and I was watching it, and I couldn't help but at the time, this is kind of how my brain works, which is getting a bit sad, but I couldn't help but notice that the kind of economy they had, of course, didn't have central banks, didn't have it had banks, and it had monetary policy based on Britain still at the time. So they were using imported money, I guess, and gold. But all of that just seemed completely different from today. And when you hear people talk about monetary policy, all of these things are historically a new phenomenon. I don't think we can hark back to any time in history where we've had a central bank and we've had all these sort of monetary policies. So, Steve, can I ask what's changed and why can't we have the same systems that we say had in colonial America in 1857, which seemed to work for a small economy? Why can't we have that sort of economy now? Why do we need all this extra complexity?
Well, it's actually the complexity of society leads to a rising role for the government to create products which are not something which you would get enough of in the private sector. Like the example I've given just recently in a couple of blog posts is how much sewage would we have if sewage was only provided by private for-profit companies? And the cost of, say, installing a sewage network across a major city, let's say like New York in the 1800s or London, would have been enormous. The per seat price would have been huge. Therefore, only the wealthy could have afforded to have indoor toilets, meaning only the wealthy would be putting their shit into a sewage system. The rest of us would be dumping it in the main street, as we used to happen in the 19th century. And of course, that was a major source of disease. One of my favorite elements there is that a large number of people moved out of Soho to get away from a cholera outbreak. This is Soho, London, including Karl Marx, vacated to get save his kids from suffering from cholera. So that was
the famous single fountain in Covent Garden, wasn't it? That was spreading cholera, and they traced it back to, and that's how the Victorians worked out that actually we need to clean up water. And it's like that's where it's coming from.
Yeah. So if you did that the way you did it with the private sector doing it, you'd only get the rich being able to afford it. Therefore, the shit of the poor would still turn up in the water system. And guess what? The rich effectively get the same water supply. So you end up with far less functional society than you have when the government says we're going to cover that. But of course, that means the government has to hire the workers, buy the capital machinery, et cetera, to build those facilities. And it's actually one reason I was looking sideways for a while there. If I can share my screen, is that allowed?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So try a screen share here. Hang on a second. I've got to go back and go to minimize level so I can see the screen. And that's the one. It's a Ravel file, of course. And let's go. I've clicked on share. Okay, and I'll make it a bit larger here. And this is taking data from the White House. This is a White House database on government finances. So it's federal spending. It doesn't include state government spending as well. But this gives you an idea of what's happened pretty much from the 1800s through to now, because the level you can see back in the 1900s, it still takes my breath away to see it. It just looks so crazy. But spending in 1909, federal government spending was 2% of GDP. Now you then see what happens with World War I. So you get a massive increase in government spending, not much of a change in taxes, all down back to roughly the same levels, but we're now talking spending 3% of GDP. Then you have the 1920s, which were right up to 1929, 3% of GDP, and that's why that was under President Calvin Coolidge. He attempted to reduce government debt because he saw that as really dangerous. So government debt fell from 15% of GDP, 30% to 15% of GDP, and spending was trivial. Then we have the Great Depression, and spending rises up then to 8% of GDP. Then you have World War II, where it hits 40% of GDP, but falls back down again. And then we've had a trend ever since then of government spending at the federal level in the United States being roughly 20% of GDP. Now, all that, this is all in reaction to what happened during the 19th century. Because rather than being this wonderful period of economic stability, which is the sort of mythical stuff you get out of Austrian economists and so on, it was a period of booms and busts. And the booms and busts driven by the private credit system, which far dominated government money creation at the time. So the fiat money creation we saw happening in the Great Depression actually necessary to economists to stabilize an unstable economy.
And so what do you say to people that are like, well, no, if we'd just left it alone during the Gilded Age, we would have ended up finally with, the private sector would have built out all that sewerage and civil society. I mean, has anyone considered that as study? I mean, that's the arguments made today, that's how that would have naturally happened.
I mean, and basically, this is thinking which doesn't involve time, which is a standard thing for neoclassical economists who never understood time. In fact, they'd prefer to abolish time. That'd make their models work much better, or be much more representative of the real world. You have products which, if you look at the time perspective that capitalists have in terms of getting a return, the length of time you've got to wait to get a return out of long-term issues like sewerage, like water supply, like education, just to a large degree, in my opinion. You just don't get enough money out of it in the time that's available. So you're not going to do it. So if you have a private sector, and only a private sector, you're not going to have the long-term facilities that we just take for granted as part of a civilized society today. And this is the only person who's worked on this recently is a good friend of mine, Avner Offer. And Avner has published a book called The Private-Public Divide. And I think there's some ways I'd like him to extend his analysis. But his basic argument is that the dividing line between something the private sector should do and the public sector should do is the length of time or the net present value of the investment versus the costs for long-lived capital items. The government is not trying to make money, can afford to build them, so we all benefit. If you leave it to the private sector, it's just not profitable. They won't do it. So it's the time horizon of investment that determines that divide between the public and the private. And if you go back to the 19th century, you wanted rabbit stew on the table. That was the main rabbit stew on the table, and some ability not to be shot by gunslingers with your little store of gold. That takes a pretty small stake. But when you come to the 20th century, with all the expectations we have about public goods, and that's what they are, they're goods which the public sector can provide and the private sector will not, you just need a larger government sector. And it's the failure to think about time, which I think is a huge root cause of the stupidity of conventional economics, including Austrian economics, of course.
Mike, I'm going to bring you in here for a sec. I want to just do some real basics for anybody that's maybe not completely clear on exactly what monetary policy is or where it sits in government. So is it easy for you to give us a back of envelope description of where monetary policy sits, say, compared to what they might have heard these terms bandied around, but don't know exactly what they mean. So you've got fiscal policy, you've got monetary policy. Where does it fit in the government, maybe compared to Steve's story about how government used to be?
Yeah, so it depends if we're talking about the past or the present. Modern fiat money economies versus Robinson Crusoe, or maybe a little more sophisticated, early 20th century, late 18th century, late 19th century economies. Very different structure, very different situation. So in modern times, think of the economy as a luxury liner, an aircraft carrier, a oil tanker, and it's going down a narrow channel. There's rocks on either side of the channel. This is bad. This is dangerous. We don't want the ship, the economy heading to lots of involuntary unemployment or high levels of inflation. At least this is the standard story. We have other issues like climate change and income distribution and stuff like that. But for now, the two biggies are inflation and involuntary unemployment. We want to keep the economy, the aircraft carrier, in the center of the channel. And it's the job of the government since Keynes. The state is the only entity with the firepower and the mandate to keep the economy in the center of the channel or as close as possible. They have two sets of tools, monetary and fiscal policy tools. Monetary policy in a sovereign nation with a sovereign fiat currency is interest rate policy. Essentially, there's regulations and stuff, but basically. And fiscal policy is taxing and spending. Think of those as tugboats, the monetary policy tugboat and the fiscal policy. And they're moving that ship, the economy, back and forth, trying to keep it in the center of the channel.
And so who's in the tug of war, excuse the pun, then between fiscal and monetary? And why is monetary policy the one that's become more, well, depends on who you talk to, I think, but why has monetary policy been the one that's become more used in recent times in terms of using interest rates, for example, to solve other problems in the economy?
Yeah, great question. And it's a political matter. Keynes wrote a book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. and he worked with the Treasury. He was a monetary economist, but he said, no, fiscal policy is the leverage point, taxing and spending. But politically, you got to get that through a state legislature, a parliament, whatever. Whereas the central banks have independence, more or less. They can close the doors, pull the shades, keep their cell phones off, and decide what interest rates are going to be, at least the target. and then they emerge, have a press conference and say, make it so. And their bond desk takes care of it. So it's much easier to pull off, much quicker. And it's done in secret.
Yeah. But Steve, it's ended up in a situation where we've created a central bank to do all that. And I guess my next question is, why was the central bank needed in order to create monetary policy at all? Or could you have monetary policy outside of having a central bank? Is that where it's all started from?
Well, I mean, it's one of the reasons that we've got the obsession on government, on interest rates and government as the way of controlling the economy, is because that's what neoclassical economists think controls the economy. It's not got any empirical validation behind it. The conventional models, what are called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, the control mechanism they have in those models is the interest rate. At the same time, they don't have fiscal policy often inside those models, because there's an argument that came out of some of the most extreme neoclassicals we've ever had. A guy called Robert Barrow in particular argued that fiscal policy is ineffective. It's actually called, they call it the policy ineffectiveness proposition, PIP, or some set of initials like that. And they basically said, well, the economy is inhabited by rational individuals, and rational individuals are people who can accurately predict the future. I'm not joking. So these people, they know that if their government taxes more, or rather government spends more now, there's got to be increasing taxation in the future. Therefore, they save money when the government runs a surplus to have the money on hand for their descendants to pay the tax when the government tries to level the whole system out. So they actually start off by assuming, well, first of all, we're all Nostradamus, or it might be Jesus, depending upon your religion, but Nostradamus is agnostic, so let's stick with Nostradamus. We're all Nostradamus. We all have an accurate model of the economy in our heads. That model happens to be a neoclassical general equilibrium model. We therefore know that the government spends more. It's got a tax in the future to take that money back. Therefore, when it spends more, we say we spend less. There's fiscal policy is ineffective. All you're left with is monetary policy. Now, that's a major reason why we've got a monetary policy dominated world, because of a bunch of neoclassical jerks who live in a fantasy world, who then try to make that fantasy become the real world with all the catastrophic impacts we've seen over the last 50 years.
So catastrophic jerks.
No, catastrophic financial crises. I mean, the very first major financial crisis actually back in 1966. It's quite intriguing that that is the date that Hyman Minsky identifies as the point of transition between what he called a financially robust society and a financially fragile society. And you'll find that the same point of difference was identified by Robert Schiller when he wrote his book Irrational Exuberance in the late 1900s. He said, when he looked at the level of irrational exuberance in the stock market, there were four peaks that he found. 3 peaks at the time: 1929, 1987, which is the stock market crash where the market fell 20% in one day, 2000, which was the end, hitting the end of the dot-com bubble, and 1966. So Minsky's gut feeling in 1973 that was the point of transition between a financially robust society and a financially fragile society, it actually turns up in the data. So we've been living in a financially fragile economy, and it's private debt that matters, not government debt. And this is, because the mainstream ignores private debt completely, their only explanations for what goes wrong is the government. And therefore, they want to get the government out of the system, which is what they've done by arguing for fiscal policy ineffectiveness. And instead, they put it all down to monetary policy. So all we've had is interest rate variations. We've had fiscal policy as well being reactive, but rather than being used to manage the economy, as Mike was saying earlier, they've just driven it off the plate. And instead, we now have this obsession, which we're seeing, of course, going on steroids with today's time. It's the fiscal policy completely, eliminate fiat money creation completely.
Sorry, I missed a little bit of that. I broke up. I'm not sure if anybody else did, Steve, but that sounded like an important point, the last bit, because what I was going to ask was then, was there any point in time where, because I've never heard either of you guys talk about for or against the Fed, whether it should exist, but based on what you've said, was there ever a time when having a central bank setting in rates independently was a good thing or could have been used wisely?
Not particularly. I mean, the last thing you want to put in,
Yeah.
people in charge, you want to put in charge of the monetary system are people who don't understand the monetary system. And that's by definition neoclassical economists, because one thing that they learn and in their economics classes, Economics 101 class, will teach you that money doesn't matter. Okay. And then
so even if
those
you
are
had
the people,
heterodox economists with halos running a central bank, it would still be a problem. What do you think?
it'd be much healthier having post-Keynesian economists running it, but they would then say, well, the interest rate should be kept low and stable. They wouldn't see the interest rate as a control mechanism. And the reason for that is, I mean, even Milton Friedman, when he couldn't get the data to fit his assumptions about the role of monetary policy, talked about long and variable lags. That's basically an excuse saying, I can't find anything in the data, so I'm going to say there's long and variable lags, and therefore there is nothing to find. The money supply still determines the economy's stability. But the focus would be on fiscal policy, because fiscal policy is what actually creates fiat money. And that would be the reason that we would, if we had post-Keynesians, we'd be much more focused upon fiscal policy. All the neoclassical stuff, all their theories, all their assumptions about ineffectiveness is based on the assumption we're all Nostradamus.
I can't help but keep coming back to this sort of trope that's and it happened with George Selgin when he was on. We're not going to get into loanable funds theory again here, but I just thought there's this worldview that was totally different, at which George acknowledged at the end of the show. And he said, in 100 years, economists like me are still going to be slugging it out. And I find that quite depressing. That
depressing. Yeah.
That no one can be convinced of other worldviews. Your facts don't work. I'm starting to wonder if we need to have a better story about how the economy can work, if you like. So that we're not just using neo-Keynesian terms or something like that. But I take your point. Like you could, so at the moment the Fed works based on that worldview that changing interest rates makes money scarcer and therefore can restrict, basically keeps Nauru a thing that can be controlled somehow, which I still believe is what they think. Do they? I mean,
that's what they do. That's what you have to look at their models and look at the models with a very skeptical eye, rather than saying, oh, these are the gurus, to realize what the hell's going on. So a large part of their logic is that expectations of inflation actually determine inflation, and expectations are formed by believing in a neoclassical model of what causes inflation. So in the neoclassical model, what causes inflation is government spending in excess of taxation. So if the government's creating money, there's got to be inflation. Therefore, if we just have a policy which cuts government money creation, that will cut inflationary expectations, and you'll have a fall in the rate of inflation while maintaining real economic equilibrium. Now that's dog's breakfast nonsense. And if you look at when the interest rates ever did really reduce economic activity, the one time that really happened was on Vokla, and you had interest rates going up to 17%. And that actually crushed it caused inflation to fall, but it caused the inflation fell because the economy fell.
By destroying the economy.
Workers could no longer get wage. Unemployment rose dramatically, so workers' bargaining power was destroyed, and ultimately so were trade unions. The decline in economic activity crushed the price of oil, which was the major source of inflation during the 1970s. So you drove inflation out of the economy by causing a recession.
Yeah, by destroying a lot of people's lives, basically.
And you had to put interest rates. You said because when you have.
Steve, you're breaking up a little bit there to me anyway. I'm not sure about anybody else. Mike, you can still. Mike, can I bring you in for a second here? I just wanted to talk about how, given the structure that we've got at the moment, where interest rates are ramped up to manage inflation, which we're on the other side of now, it seems, who does that benefit? I mean, as a system, you look at a system and you look at you've pretty much got small businesses, workers, renters and stuff on one side who are pretty much have to take whatever's given to them in terms of prices. Who benefits then from higher interest rates? Is it meant to affect absolutely everybody, and does it? I mean, because if that's meant to control inflation, then where does the effect come? Not everybody has the ability to change their buying habits based on an interest rate.
Well, of course, all questions in economics can be answered with "it depends," or "it depends on the elasticities," as we would say. So yeah, when there's changes in, let's say, interest rates, certain people benefit more, certain groups benefit more than others. So if you're a saver, if you're on fixed income, and your 401k is that you're drawing from are earning more, hooray. If you have to pay higher interest rates, boo. So, and with inflation, there's lots of different causes of inflation. And the central banks tend to treat all inflation as arising from the same place, or at least there's one cure for inflation, irrespective of where it's coming from. And, that's interest rates. If the only tool I have is a hammer, I treat every problem as a nail. And so certain groups will benefit and certain groups will not. So it's like tariffs. Who's going to benefit? Well, it depends. Certain people will benefit, certain people will not. So the question is, on net, what happens? And hard to say with your mental model. You really need formal modeling.
Yeah.
Even then, it depends on, well, what kind of formal model? What are your assumptions and what have you?
I guess I have this, Steve, I want you to put this pet theory of mine to bed, because I think I may be going crazy, but it seems to me that when you have interest rates get jacked up for a time, there's a massive lag afterwards when inflation has come down, which may be unrelated entirely because it's to do with supply or perhaps price gouging amongst other things, or a thing like a pandemic, supply shock, where you've shut down the economy. And then there's this lag and interest rates come down much later. And it's as if there's a cultural acceptance that big chunks of it need to be protected by these interest rates being high enough to pay them out for a bit longer until, they're sort of paid back from the lag at the front end. And I don't think that's deliberate, like a conspiracy, but that seems to be the culture of the central banks, to operate that way so that people keep money in bonds for longer. I want you to kill that idea for me and tell me that's nonsense.
Well, I mean, this is one of the great tragedies trying to talk about policy, because policy is informed by theory. And if the theory is wrong, you would hope that over time it gets amended by actual experience and becomes closer to being an accurate description of reality. But this theory, the neoclassical theory, is so much into people's ideological perceptions of capitalism that they don't learn from their past mistakes. Now, when you try to control interest rates, I said one thing Milton Friedman said about interest rates and inflation is, long and variable lags between putting rates up and having an effect on the rate of inflation and that sort of thing. But the reason there's a lag is often because of the structure of the financial system. So if you look at mortgages in America, for example, almost all mortgages in America are fixed rate. So you take out a mortgage, that's the rate you pay until you've paid the mortgage off. Whereas in a country like Australia, and also the UK, I think, you have variable interest rates. So you take out a mortgage, and then your mortgage ends up being the federal funds rate plus 2 or 3%. And the banks will very rapidly put the rate up when interest rates go up, not so rapidly reduce the mortgage rate when the rates go down. Now, in America, what that means is you can have a government putting up interest rates and having no impact upon people's spending because they've got on a fixed rate mortgage. They're still paying out the same amount to service their mortgage. All you do is you hit the new borrowers, potential new borrowers. So new borrowers they've got to pay a much higher interest rate. They might not go into the market, so you reduce the demand for housing, for new housing or new mortgages. That's a very slow, very ineffective system. Whereas when you have fiscal policy, when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, that instantly, as soon as the spending occurs, changes the amount of money in your bank account. So fiscal policy tends to be much more immediate than interest rates. And there's a double whammy with interest rates, which Warren Mosler has been making a lot of recently. And that is when you have a large amount of bonds being owned, not by the banks, but owned by the non-bank financial institutions and wealthy individuals, and you have government debt running at about 100% of GDP, which is the level it is these days, then a 5% rate of interest on government bonds sort of works out to being 5% of GDP stimulus for the economy, put in the hands of the wealthy.
Very regressive.
Okay?
Basic income
Yeah.
for people who've already got money in proportion.
Yeah. So what you're trying to use rates to control the rate of inflation and reduce economic activity, but you're actually putting a stimulus in terms of the amount of interest being paid on particularly new government bonds being so high. It doesn't have that effect because government bond rates are normally fixed as well. So if you buy a government bond in 2010, you're paying a price which means the yield is say 2%, and that yield remains at 2%. If you paid $1,000 to buy a bond, say 30-year bond back in 2010, then you got $20 per year on that bond, and you still get $20 per year. But if you try to sell the bond, it's going to sell for less than $1,000 because new bonds are being issued at 5%. So it's got effects in all sorts of directions. But the interest rate is nowhere near the control mechanism that neoclassical economists think it is. And therefore, when they try to run the economy that way, rather than running it, they add another force of instability.
Yeah, how come they keep doing that? And Mike, maybe I'll bring you in here in the sense that they keep on seeming to have the data that proves it. And you look at the graphs and it's like, well, they don't prove anything, but they use data in a way that says, or it's not clear enough, it seems. What's going on? Why are they looking at the same spreadsheet as you, Steve? I don't get it.
Well, actually, you should drag Ty out here for a while because he's been doing work comparing his model with applied MMT and inflation forecast to what the conventionals. G'day, Ty. What the conventionals put up and what the conventionals always assume is going to return to equilibrium. So their forecasts aren't a prediction of the model itself. It's a prediction of the theory that you'll return to equilibrium, and it completes on failing, completely missing the data. But they get away with it because even though economists dominate our society, they're not necessary for our society to exist. If we abolished all engineers, we'd be back to the Stone Age tomorrow. Okay? If we abolished all economists tomorrow, including me, we'd still be in the capitalist economy. You don't need economists to run the economy, and they don't face any necessary consequences for getting it badly wrong. So therefore, they continue spouting this garbage without ever being corrected by the real world.
Yeah, just a comment on inflation and income distribution, because I see a little bit of that in the comments. Again, we return to stocks and flows, right? So the general level of prices, you can think of that as a stock, a bathtub, and an inflow to that stock, we'll call that the change in the general level of prices upward would be a flow or inflation. And if you turn off that inflow, if you make inflation zero, all you're going to do is keep the general level of prices where they're at. They're going to stop going up. They are not going to go down. A zero rate of inflation does not mean the general level of prices is going down. It means they're just not going up anymore. And no central bank is going to shoot for a target of zero inflation because that's perilously close to triggering a deflationary spiral. So they have a target around 2%. So inflation in the best of all worlds to a central banker is creeping or going up. The general level of prices are going up at 2%. Now, here's the income distribution issue. It's like a ratchet. You know, when you ratchet up your car, when you're going to change a flat tire, it goes up, but it doesn't go down, right? So the only way for workers to get higher real wages is to get wage increases. Prices aren't coming down, not the general level of prices anyway. So unless they do that, they've lost ground. And there's your income distribution impact.
And there's another effect which is avoiding deflation, which Mike mentioned a moment ago. When you take a look at the long-term price data, and you can get this from the Bank of International Settlements, they've got data on prices in the UK going back to 1661 and prices in America, I think, going back to at least 1800. When you look at it, what you see is I've got to get my hand in the vision here, a nice low level of flat prices until the Federal Reserve is created, and then the prices take off. Okay? And people look at this saying, oh, look, there was no inflation before the Federal Reserve, and there's only been inflation since. Let's abolish the Federal Reserve. When you take a close look at the data, what you see is there was more inflation in the Federal Reserve and pre-Second World War period than there is now. The difference is there's no deflation. Now, so the highest rate of inflation we've had in the post-war period is something like about 17%. That was during the late 80s. The highest rate of inflation in the 1800s is about 30%.
Actually, on a recent show, you pulled up a graph that showed that. I don't know if you've got it to hand, but if you haven't, it was quite dramatic.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to find it right now. So I need metadata in my file manager to tell me which particular Ravel file I need to bring up for that particular piece of information.
And that was quite revealing, but if the context there changed completely from what you hear from I guess from Austrian type economists who are like, oh no, we had this perfect economy in the Gilded Age. Why can't we have that back again?
Yeah. No, in fact, we had an incredibly volatile economy with inflation going from plus 30 to minus 20 very, very rapidly. And what that meant was when you had deflation, anybody who was in debt suddenly had to pay a large amount more. And so that deflation actually caused a private debt crisis. And it's like every 10 to 15 years, there was a serious crisis in America. And then with that collapse, you had a deflationary crisis, a small version of the Great Depression every 10 to 15 years was what the 18th century was really like, not the stability that people look at when they see just that single line. I'll shut up for a second. I'll see if I can find that particular Ravel file.
So Mike,
let me just leap in here on some of the stuff that's been said a little bit earlier. Why do we have the situation that we have? Well, first of all, the economists wrestled away the Fed chairmanship from the bankers to the economists, and they've more or less retained it.
Oh, yeah.
So the bankers kind of knew banking, but the economists are guided by theory, which is the standard story. But when we were looking at Steve's charts earlier about spending and taxing and so forth, the United States at least was founded on the idea of a small, powerless central government. And the local and state governments, the former colonies, would be the entity of the states. So we have a whole system of checks and balances and the Bill of Rights, amendments to the Constitution to check and keep small the central government, right? And that dominated thinking all the way into the 20th century. I mean, Alexander Hamilton tried to have a national bank, and the Jeffersonians were saying, no, yeoman farmers, keep it small. And so, he was vehemently opposed. Woodrow Wilson tried to make government bigger. He couldn't stand the fact that we were so handcuffed. Calvin Coolidge was shown earlier, and I think there was a disaster. It was either him or Harding, a flood or something, and they appealed him, and he said, hey, I'm sorry, that's not the role of the federal government. Go to your state government. It was only when the Great Depression arose that people said, help us, please help us. And Roosevelt in the New Deal was the one who just said, I got to do something here. And he sort of broke the laissez-faire small government idea with his New Deal and Social Security and all the various government programs. In a parallel fashion, the classical economists were riffing off of Adam Smith, and there was only economics. There wasn't macroeconomics and micro. Today we say they're using microeconomics, and they suffered from the fallacy of composition. And that is, what's true for you and true for me must be true of the whole economy. You got to have a balanced budget and what have you. And it was Keynes, theoretically, where the economists would follow them. The politicians, Roosevelt and all that, did it on their own. They kind of did it in parallel. Keynes said, no, you're thinking about the problem incorrectly. And, in the loanable funds market, saving is a leakage, but it's reinjected in the market for loanable funds as investment. There's an autopilot. Keynes says that's wrong. You got it opposite. Investment causes saving. Saving doesn't cause investment. So he gave us a new way of thinking about things. Keynes was somebody who said you need the government to stabilize the system. Same thing with his Bancorp plan. It's all about stabilizing, being a buffer stock, stabilizing an unstable system. And that held sway until, as Steve was pointing out, the new classicals. So Keynes wiped out the classicals. Now the new classicals came in. And they won the day because the Keynesians had a little bit of a problem during the stagflation of the 70s, right? And he mentioned Ricardian equivalence. And to let me complete my point, the new classicals, the Lucas folks, the rational expectations folks, changed macroeconomics from a way of stabilizing an unstable system, keeping that aircraft carrier in the center of the channel, to a game of chess, meaning we all have rational expectations. We're trying to outwit one another. The private sector is trying to outwit the public sector. And if that's going on, the private sector is undoing the efforts of the public sector to stabilize things, deficit spending and whatever, as Steve mentioned. So the whole focus was changed from stabilizing an unstable system to this game of chess where government interventions aren't very effective. And these are the people who have seized the Fed.
I got Deplorable Kulak's comment popped up. Thanks, Julie. If you're going to loan money to somebody to have money in the bank, you can't just create it from thin air. That's our problem. And I think when I first got exposed to the thinking of, you, Steve, and others in the heterodox economic community, this was the blockage for me, that there was any way ever that money came from thin air, as it were. And I think that's the fiscal policy side of it. The other side I want to talk about is why do we not talk anymore enough about fiscal policy, where it would replace monetary policy and what it would do?
Well, this comment by Kulak is a typical naive, either Austrian or neoclassical view about how banks operate, because what he's basically saying, we've got to abolish accounting. Okay, because the reason that banks can create money is because they're allowed to mark up both the assets and liabilities side of the ledger. That's why you want to become a bank. No other organization can do that. And so what they do to create money is they create a deposit by putting money in your deposit account, and they put it at the same time, they put that same amount in the liability you have to them, their asset, the debt. That's how they create money. And that's what banks have been doing for roughly 600 years. So what Austrians are telling us to do, we should stop doing what happened historically and do something that's magical in their vision of money as money is a commodity. Fundamentally, they think about money like gold. They think that's what money should actually be. And it's just, I'm afraid it's nonsense in the real world. We live in a world in which double entry bookkeeping rules what both banks and governments do. And banks create money by lending out, by increasing the level of debt, private debt, and governments create it by going to negative equity, which creates positive equity for everybody else in the economy. That's just how it happens.
And if anybody wants a deep dive on that, George Selgin and Steve had a talk about loanable funds from the different, totally different worldviews. So if you want a deep dive on that, that's in the live stream from a few months ago. What about this one, Steve or Mike? Inflation happens because bad guys, I guess. No, I'm being unfair. Capitalists need inflation to keep up with interest rates, kind of the way that we've designed it. There's an element of that a good amount of inflation is how the system is made for. And Mike, you were hinting at this before, with zero inflation would still keep prices exactly stable. So you've got to have wage inflation to some degree to get ahead. What do you think about what's behind this sort of comment that capitalists need inflation? He might not have, Nicholas might not have meant it like this, but it sounds like a sort of, well, it's the only way that system can work. Is that what you think's behind that question?
It's,
I'll call it a statement.
I'll let Dave, my mic whack in as a moment, but this is actually, if you think about what inflation does, it reduces the value of money. And Austrians and neoclassicals and gold obsessives all believe that shouldn't happen. But if you think of it from money from the point of view of a physicist, everything else suffers until the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. It decays. So scientists like Soddy, who came in and Frederick Soddy and saw the monetary system, said it should actually decay over time. And that actually encourages one of the three purposes of money. Money is, we will talk about money being a unit of account, which it is, a means of payment, which it is, and a store of value, where it's a fairly bad form of a store of value. The people who obsess about commodity money and not getting rid of inflation and so on, focus on the third role. But if we didn't have money as a means of exchange, we wouldn't have capitalism. So a bit of inflation is a bit like, therefore, having a bit of entropy applied to money. And what it means is it's an encouragement to spend. Now, if you don't have demurrage, if you don't have some way of depreciating the money supply, then it's an encouragement not to spend. And that actually undermines what people see as the strength of capitalism.
Yeah, I wish that this was talked about more, because there's a fundamental split, it seems, in people's minds between this idea of hard money and fiat, which we've been living with for a long time, that somehow deflation will fix all of our problems. And it's just like, well, the last time we've seen that, which was thankfully a long time ago, wasn't pretty, and wasn't an easy way out of it.
Yeah.
So, Mike,
actually, I found that chart. I found that chart, by the way, Dave, on the price level on the inflation rate. So if you can whack that one up and just quickly show it. This is from the Minneapolis Fed. Now, people would look at that and think, oh, look, here's instability. Prices start to rise in about 1945, that period of time. And it's been inflation beforehand. And before that, we had stability. But if you look at the rate of change of that, and I'll just actually drag this chart up here, what you see is during the 18th century, there were huge levels of inflation. That peak there's about 24%, 23%. And then bang, massive deflation of well below 10% at various times, prices falling that much. And when that happened, when you had deflation, people went bankrupt. You had the monetary system causing instability in the production system. So what we've got now, people focus upon the continuous inflation, but it was better than what happened in the 18th century. A lot of creative things happened there, without a doubt, but a lot of massive instability and chaos as well. And even though the Federal Reserve's done a poor job of trying to control that, we have less destructive instability after the Great Depression than we had beforehand.
And so where does that leave us today with the tools that we've got? And, I don't think they're going away anytime soon. The Fed is probably the least worst tool, because if we've got to have a central bank, right? Or could you picture a world where we don't have a central bank, and that we can, because we need to get rid of people who economists are not controlling it very well, or not running it with great wisdom?
I'll let Mike dive in here if you feel like it, Matt.
Well, I think a lot of the problem is this. I kind of mentioned the economists took over from the bankers at the Fed, and they have a neoclassical model in mind. And undoubtedly, there's some of that is true. They don't change their minds when they're there. But I do think some economists get in there, and the way they write and speak, once they're in there, they've gotten out from behind their desks, and they're actually seeing how the system works. I do think some of them get an understanding of how things work. But the description of how it works is confusing to the average citizen. It's confusing to politicians and what have you. And the mental model that the national economy should run like my company, my house, my city government, my state government is so embedded that you just go with the flow, I guess, of the standard narrative, and that you'll be seen as crazy if you try and go against it or something. So they don't do that. They just go with the flow.
And then it always strikes me, then it's a cultural problem, and not a mathematical problem, or a scientific problem, which is what it should be. That always strikes me as crazy. But I agree. I think it's people in those positions that get inculcated and then isolated. I guess they don't hear from outside voices. So now to the audience that's regularly listening to us, you'll be surprised to know that we're going to be around for 1 hour tonight. So we've actually got 10 minutes left, believe it or not. So get your questions in the live chat, so that Mike and Steve can maybe we can pick up on a couple more. Ty was going to jump in, but we lost him there. Not sure. It's probably because I didn't get to him quick enough. We went, right, I'm off, because he's an important guy in all areas.
Oh, here he goes. He's back.
So I'm engineering the show, so it's just really difficult. We're trying to go with new scene selections and whatnot, and it requires constant button pressing.
Well, stay behind the scenes, Ty. I don't want to pull you in for that. There was other things I was going to ask Steve and Mike, but if you've got something...
I want both. I want both Steve and Mike's opinion. Really, the bottom line is monetary policy an effective tool to steer our economy? Is it effective to a small degree, a medium degree, or a large degree? It can really, cure the ills of the economy. I want to hear those opinions. Or does it require a mixture of fiscal policy, or should we just, do away with it, leave rates at 2% and, walk the dogs home?
Randy Ray will say monetary policy is fiscal policy because the Treasury and the central bank have to work together. And the central bank is reactive, not proactive, that taxing and spending occur first. And then the Fed does have an interest rate target, and they react to what's going on in response to the spending in the system. By the way, one point that we always talk about interest rates or the rate of interest, except for quantitative easing, where the Fed was intervening during the Great Recession, on the 10-year Treasury, trying to manipulate mortgage rates. They manipulate the end of the yield curve or set a target for the end of the yield curve, and the rest of the yield curve is supposed to respond. It actually is not doing that right now with respect to housing anyway. Mortgage rates, the Fed has been cutting, and mortgage rates have not been going down, at least in the U.S. So it's a bit of a murky soup as to exactly how does the yield curve work, and where should if the Fed's job is to intervene with interest rates in response to what's going on, where should they be intervening? Is it the end of the yield curve, quantitative easing, or something else?
Yeah, and in terms of my attitude on the interest rate effectiveness, I think interest rates are ineffective. And the reason they're ineffective is because, again, neoclassical thought forgets about the role of time and uncertainty. So if you look at how Hicks bastardized Keynes to give us the ISLM model, he basically said investment is a function of the rate of interest. No, it's not. It's a function of your expectations of the future, and you're uncertain about the future. Interest rates are a fairly minor modification to people's expectations about the future. So you have a tiny tool which isn't all that effective, and yet that's what you're trying to manage the economy with. And the only way you can actually have any success in it is to put rates up so much that you simply destroy people's expectations of the future, and you cause people to go bankrupt as well. And those bankruptcies, an inability to pay your grocery bills as well, cascade through the system. It's a club. It's either a feather or a club. There's nothing.
Yeah,
in between.
I agree with that. That's Volcker in the early '80s used that club. That was.
Yeah. So it's a feather when it's too small. It's a club when it's too large. There's nothing in between.
And what about the fabled soft landing that we apparently got last time round? How about, was that a fluke?
Well, that's partly because the government, this is where the fiscal policy is extremely effective, because fiscal policy creates money, and it puts money directly into people's bank accounts and people spend it. So it's actually much faster. Fiscal policy operates much faster than monetary policy does. The form of monetary policy that I'd like to see the Federal Reserve actually engaging in is not setting the interest rate, but changing its buying and selling of bonds with the non-bank public, because that takes money out of circulation. If you want to actually reduce monetary demand, then rather than putting up interest rates, what you do is sell more bonds. You may have to drop rates to do it to some extent, but you basically see the bond sales as what actually mop up money out of the private sector. Because when the government sells bonds to the non-bank public, or the banks sell bonds to the non-bank public, that actually, the way that the public pays for that is by reducing its deposit accounts, which is the money supply. So in terms of being an effective monetary tool, you're better to use your open market operations than you are trying to set the interest rate. Now, what happens with neoclassicals in charges, they make everything subservient to the interest rate policy they've got. So that's what drives their bond sales and purchases, not attempts to dampen this money supply by using bonds and directly affecting what's in circulation.
I also think, this isn't exactly monetary policy, but I think central banks could do a better job in the regulatory responsibilities by thinking about how to better stress test banks so that we don't get into serious financial crises. We had a little bit of a blip with Silicon Valley Bank a year or two ago, right? And We've seen a couple of times over my lifetime anyway, where that can get out of hand rather quickly, and things have to happen over a weekend, or the world's financial system is in jeopardy. And so, going, semi-regulatory or laissez-faire-ish, and letting these financial institutions do what they want, or, without, severe restrictions, I think is a bad idea. We got to get a better handle on that.
And I've heard, I think Randy Ray has done this as well, but Mosler has explicitly talked about a ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, being a way to manage all this, and you've hinted at that too, Steve. But as a possibility, and you're talking about regs there with the SVP debacle. I remember Mosler talking about how you basically can have an unlimited deposit if you want, because it's backed by the central bank. You can literally have it unlimited because they take it out of one bank and put it into another one. They just account for it. It makes no difference. So that could be solved that way, but it's because we're hooked on this idea that there's finite money and it runs out, that we still have the possibility of something like SVP. Mind you, got Peter Thiel in the background probably stirring things up in that case. But the ZIRP policy was based on the idea that you would regulate, Mike, to like individually down to who actually can get a loan in the first place more, which is how banks, are meant to be regulated, rather than just based on markets giving loans wherever possible.
You do need credit guidance because, and this is where I love Richard Vague's work. In fact, I must get Richard on the show one day. Banks follow fads. If there's a fad to supply money to oil companies in Texas, that's what they'll do. If there's a fad for housing, that's what they'll do. You need credit guidance because the buggers have the ultimate short-term perspective. Whatever is giving them bonus at the end of the year is what they finance. You actually say, well, the finance sector should be a servant of the physical economy, the production side of the economy, not the master. And therefore we should have credit guidance and tell them you can't lend for asset bubbles, you can't lend for mortgages, and create an asset bubble there, or margin loans for stock market bubbles. You should be lending the financial sector. And because it's, again, to become a bank, you've also got to be authorized by the government. So there's an extent to which they've got to have a social role to fulfill. And if you leave them to their own devices, they don't.
And so the zero rate interest policy is possible in that scenario?
I don't like that one. I think there's a reason for it. If you give banks interest on bonds, then that's cheap money in a sense, but it's paying for them having built the payment system that the capitalist system absolutely needs. So I don't mind a 2 or 3% rate of interest on bonds, but I do object to trying to modify that rate to see if you can control the real economy.
So it should be fixed, and so that people can plan ahead and then regulate banks so they can't just give that money for speculation purposes, for example.
Just spitballing here, but if I were to look into my crystal ball like economists do, I would wonder what the role, if any, for the commercial banks will be in the future if let's say the Federal Reserve ends up developing and releasing a digital currency,
CBDC.
I don't know the answer to that as I sit here, but I think that's something that could really drastically change the whole system and the role of monetary policy and its impact and what have you. My understanding is a federal digital currency is in beta testing or something right now. I think they're worried about getting hacked and stuff, but I suspect the rest of my lifetime we'll see something like that, and I think that's going to really disrupt.
Second that. I think that's we need something like that, and that would justify having a much smaller private financial sector and having a government system maintain a payment system at minimal cost, and capitalism might actually work a lot better that way.
And actually, I brought this up just as an aside a couple of episodes ago, but it was about there was a beta test done here in the UK, Steve, and I think you knew about it because you knew the people behind it. They were basically just they were experience or UX testing the software that they might use in case people want a digital wallet and have a CBDC here for the Bank of England. I don't know how far it got, to be honest with you, but I found it fascinating that they were going that far to just road testing some of that technology.
Yeah.
But yeah, it may be a long way off. Well, we're at the top of the hour.
That's
James,
the
that was
show.
very good. It feels fast.
1 hour's
you know,
not
it's an
very
hour.
long at all, is it?
I know, but I think we covered a lot.
We might need some time inflation next. Maybe go 75 minutes.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about time inflation. There might be interest on that. Until next time, it's great to have you all here live. We hope you'll be back next week. And from now, it's goodbye from Steve Keenan and friends. But we're still here.